Hey guys, what's up? Fantasy music. What is fantasy music? There's no actual genre called fantasy music. You don't go to a music store or a record shop or a CD store or anything like that. Or you don't go on well, you might do it on a streaming service like Spotify or something like that where you like fantasy music, but fantasy music doesn't really do anything, say anything about the music itself other than the topic of that music is a fantasy topic, right? And that could be anything. Fantasy music can be classical or hard rock or any kind of music can be fantasy music. I mean, if you take a jazz song and make it about some kind of fantasy topic, it'll be fantasy music. So, what is it? But yes, there are music, sounds, and bands whose whose subject almost exclusively, their whole subject of their band is fantasy music. It's about fantasy. It's about books of fantasy, movies of fantasy, games of fantasy, comics of fantasy. Anything, any stories about fantasy, they will sing about it. Bands like Blind Guardian, um, bands like Hawkwind, right? Bands that basically have a lot of interest in fantasy, so there's a whole genre called power metal. There's a whole genre of heavy metal music called power metal, and it's not a power metal at all. It's actual fantasy metal. It's bands that sing about fantasy topics, fantasy subjects. There are bands that sing almost exclusively about Lord of the Rings, right? Almost exclusively about Lord of the Rings. And like every song is about Lord of the Rings or inspired by Lord of the Rings. Hawkwind sings a lot, not entirely. I mean, they've got songs all over the place. Hawkwind, they're an old band. And um, the guy from Lemmy from Motorhead was actually in Hawkwind, before he actually got kicked out because he couldn't get to the concerts on time, and he was get and so it's funny, but he started his own band, became Motorhead, and he became bigger than Hawkwind. People know Motorhead, they don't really know Hawkwind, unless you're in England. I think you know Hawkwind a lot more because they're basically very, very close with Michael Moorcock and the Elric saga and the Eternal Champion stories and stuff like that. So Hawkwind has a lot of music about Elric, about the writings of Michael Moorcock, and he was actually, I don't know if he was part of the band or in the band or wrote some songs for the band, but he was very, very involved in the band itself, and they were like friends and they were together. And a lot of their stuff was just about his writing and about his stories. And there's Blind Guardian, which is like completely, think about Blind Guardian is it's very, very, like, all of the songs are very similar to each other, but it's all fantasy, even like Ronnie James Dio was very, very heavily influenced by fantasy. Interesting about Ronnie James Dio, who did the band Dio. Yeah, he was in Black Sabbath, he was in Rainbow, and then he had the band Dio, which was like his own band, and he was great in it. I think his best stuff, or some of his best stuff, of course it was in Sabbath also, but some of his best stuff was in Dio. I mean, some of his best stuff was in his own band. And I actually saw him once live, and it was really amazing. But a lot of the stuff, and the thing about Dio is it's very, very fantasy oriented, but Dio would write his own fantasy stories. He wouldn't necessarily sing about other people's fantasy stories, but he would write his own fantasy stories. Even the song Holy Diver, if you look at the video of Holy Diver, that video is basically him like carrying a sword, fighting with some other guy carrying a sword, right? There's tons of, I mean, the cover of Sacred Heart, that the album was a dragon holding this weird kind of heart object on the cover of the album. So he was very, very influenced by fantasy, and a lot of the songs that he wrote was about the fantasy genre, was about the fantasy topic. And so that was one of them. But there's tons. I mean, the whole power metal thing. Now, the thing is, I'm not that into power metal because it's just so into fantasy. It's so fantasy that it's a little bit kind of nerdy into that fantasy, because they just sing about Dungeons and Dragons, and they just sing about like movies and music and whatever it else, movies and books, and they sing about stories I've never read. No, they're good. I like them. I like the power metal I've heard. I thought it was really good. I also like the sound of it, and I like how it sounds. But it does evoke. It is about fantasy, and it does evoke that fantasy kind of mindset. There are people that write music so that you can put the CD into the CD player and play Dungeons and Dragons and have a background sound, with sounds of like, it just makes you feel like you're in a castle or in a mountain or in a dungeon, and there's monsters lurking and stuff like that, right? And there's magic in the air, things like that. There's that kind of thing. There's some like classical stuff that is very fantasy, like it says fantasy, which I don't find it that fantasy, because classical is all very, very musical, and if they do sing in classical, it's like opera and you can't understand it because it's in Italian or it's in some language, and it's very, very sung. Not that you can you understand a lot of songs, you can't understand the lyrics, but especially when they're in another language or sang in an opera or something like that. But a lot of like bands, even though they're not exclusively fantasy, they're very influenced by fantasy and stories they've read, and some of the songs are about characters and books and stories that are fantasy. Like Blue Oyster Cult has a couple of songs about Elric. One of them is The Veteran of the Psychic Wars. The Veteran of the Psychic Wars was actually played in Heavy Metal, the motion picture. And not the entire song, because they did snippets of songs. And there's an actual soundtrack of Heavy Metal, the motion picture, with all of the different songs, and that includes Mob Rules sung by Dio by Black Sabbath, and it includes The Veteran of the Psychic Wars by Blue Oyster Cult and stuff like that. So that was one of the songs they did about Elric, which was The Veteran of the Psychic Wars, which I do believe it is about Elric, because it is like, I heard it was about Elric, and it does sound like it's about Elric. And there's another song which is even more directly about Elric, called Black Blade, and it is about Stormbringer, which is like Elric's black sword, So there's two, songs about Elric, and just because Black Blade is about Elric, I would say is another reason to believe that The Veteran of the Psychic Wars is also about Elric, because they are aware of Elric. They didn't accidentally write a song that is just parallel to someone else's actual story. No, they actually, I do believe they were influenced by it. Hawkwind was very influenced by Elric. I don't recall, because I'm not that into Hawkwind and I don't listen to them that much, but I do like them when I do hear them. But I do know that Michael Moorcock was involved in in some of the songs. There was a band called the Cotton Floss, Candy Floss something. I'm saying Cotton Floss because it's cotton candy in America, and in England it's Candy Floss. It's called cotton candy is Candy Floss, and in the two places. It was something about the Candy Floss something, whatever it is. It was another band that I think Moorcock was directly in, and he was definitely influenced a lot of the work of Hawkwind, and they are from the same country, or they're kind of in the same area, and stuff like that. So there's power metal, there's Blind Guardian, which is interesting. Blind Guardian is just like, every song is fantasy based. Their shirts have fantasy pictures on them. Their albums have fantasy pictures on them. If you look at the band, like some bands are very, very inspired by like Conan the Barbarian. Conan the Barbarian. A lot of bands, like there's guys like there's a band called Thor, and there are guys that guy basically dresses like Conan the Barbarian. Like, he doesn't wear a shirt. He wears like a fuzzy kind of like pair of shorts, and he's got like spiked bracers or whatever it is, and carries a big sword. It's like, and then he dresses that on stage and calls himself Thor. There's that, right? There's Thor. There's not like just one band that is, you know, based on Conan the Barbarian. There's a lot of bands that are based on Conan the Barbarian. There's a lot of bands that dress like Conan the Barbarian, that are very, very much sing in the philosophy of Conan the Barbarian. And even like the soundtrack of Conan the Barbarian is used as a fantasy kind of like soundtrack. Basically, it's used as fantasy music. It's used as fantasy, like a background thing. Like it's yes, it is like very Valhalla sounding, right? It's very like it is very that sounding um like you're in that time, you're in that world, and it's very, very like very there's no like lyrics in it, but if you listen to the soundtrack while you're watching the movie, it accompanies the movie, right? So when there's a lot of action, tension, and suspense happening, the soundtrack like goes up. It's like becomes tense, like dun 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 dun, dun, and he's like riding his horse and swinging his sword at the same time, and they use the music to influence the emotion of the movie, right? They use the music to influence the emotion of the movie, and it's got a lot to do with that. It's got a lot to do with how they use the emotion. Like even the music in Skyrim, like the game Skyrim, if you note, it's very, very fantasy sounding, and they use the same concept as they used in Conan the Barbarian. When you're in a battle, when you're fighting monsters, or even when you're fighting a dragon, or you're fighting monsters, or you're in some kind of action scene, the music goes up and it's like dun 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 dun, dun. It's like the music just like intensifies and makes it and goes up. You don't notice it right away, but it does influence how you feel when you're playing the game. And if you're just running around, the forests and stuff, going from one place to another, and there's not really anything happening, some bears occasionally walking by that try to attack you, there's just like do 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 do, like that kind of thing, and it very, very, it makes you feel the tension of the actual scene, right? And there's a lot of even in sci-fi, I would say there's a lot of fantasy influence in sci-fi also, because techno is really like it's a very, very close to the genre of cyberpunk or sci-fi, right? Because even like techno, like the album covers of techno album covers, a lot of them have robots on it or some kind of technology or some weird futuristic looking stuff, right? And it's very, very new sounding. Like, AI can produce techno music. Computers use techno music, and it's very, very like high tech. It's techno because they don't use acoustic guitars. They could if they wanted to, right? But they don't. They use synthesizers. They use computers, right? They use even like their guitars are like hooked up to mixers and computers and keyboards and synthesizers. Like their musical instruments are hooked up to synthesizers. Like you can play techno with a violin, but it's an electric violin where the sound is warped, and it feels sci-fi. It feels technological, right? It feels like that. And I would say like the sound of cyberpunk is very, very much a very techno sound. And I would expect that a lot of people in cyberpunk stories would be listening to techno music, right? Just like the story, like a lot of the cyberpunk stories, a lot of them are very, very. I think that what it is with the cyberpunk stories and techno is the techno is very influenced by those stories, and I feel like even though techno doesn't really have a lot of lyrics, not a lot of lyrics that you can understand anyway, because a lot of techno lyrics are very repetitive or whatever. But a lot of them try to make you feel like you're like on another planet or in a spaceship or in the future or in a cyberpunk kind of environment. They have like sounds of robots and sounds, like very, very technological sounds, like sort of the like you're in the movie Tron or something like that. There's that kind of sound. And if you look at um, a lot of like cyberpunk like movies and games or whatever it is, they have that. They've got like that. The music in those are very technological, are very like mixed. You don't get a lot of like acoustic sounds and like instruments um in cyberpunk and in like sci-fi. But then if you go back to um like fantasy like movies and stuff, you get a lot of songs in lutes, and actually a lot of fantasy music is also sometimes very acoustic, and it's got a lack of computers, it's got a lack of sci-fi things, it's got a very natural sound. It's like basically all acoustic, it's all lutes and it's all flutes and it's all drums and it's all singing, and it doesn't have um, any kind of like mixing, or it doesn't have like augmentation. It doesn't have anything that alters or warps the music. It doesn't have that warp sound. It's like it doesn't have that, like sort of that like that techno dance floor, that's that thing, that's going on. Even the game Castlevania, like Symphony of the Night, has a great soundtrack. And I would say that's it's a fantasy game, but it's also like a horror game, but it's not like scary horror. It's a horror game because it's got vampires. It's a horror game because um it's got monsters, but then it's a fantasy game because it's got monsters. It's a fantasy game because it's got like armor and weapons like swords and magic, right? So I would say it's also a very fantasy game. And the entire soundtrack of that is very, very much a a matter of also intensifying emotion and like kind of like evening out emotion. When you're just like going from place to place, it's just like, and then the music is cool, but when you're like in combat, the music like intensifies and stuff like that. And there were a lot of, and what techno does is it takes um, that sound, whatever it was in the game, and makes it like mixes it and makes it sound cool, and then repeats, has a lot of repetitive like lyrics. Like there was um, a techno song that came out after Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and they were like in the song they took the sound bite right in the beginning of the game, where the vampire says that it is not by their hand that they were once again given flesh, right? It's interesting, which means like it kind of means that they got basically woken from death and became a vampire and stuff like that, by someone did that to them, and they took that one soundbite and they put a lot of techno sounds in it, and they put that soundbite in it. So it's interesting because like yeah, it's a techno song, and they played it during like in clubs and like in dance floors, and where there's like DJs and all kinds of like lights and sounds and lasers and stuff like that. But then if anyone knows that game, they would know where that soundbite came from, and it kind of is a little bit of a message that ha ha ha, I also know that, I also like that game, I also played that game, I also know what that is. So it's interesting. And what's interesting about like fantasy music by itself is specifically something like power metal, because that is almost, whether you like metal or not, or you're into that or not, like you know it's the thing about it is that it is a genre, and I'm going to say this is the only genre, maybe there's other genres I'm not aware of, this is the only fantasy genre music in existence, I do believe. Because yes, there are bands that occasionally talk about fantasy topics, occasionally might sing about Lord of the Rings or some fantasy books that they read, or some a band that might have a song about Star Wars, right? Or something like that, or like a band that has a song about Blade Runner, or has a song about some fantasy movie, like Conan the Barbarian or whatever it is. But power metal, these are bands that, and any band that's a power metal band, these are bands that basically have that same sound, a very, very metal sound, but also some sounds that do sound like they came from Conan the Barbarian, um, and their lyrics. And I'm gonna say specific, like if you're gonna like classify or like describe, what is a fantasy song, it would be because music, like you can't instrumentally evoke fantasy. You could, depending on how you did it. If someone writes an instrumental that feels like it's from a fantasy movie, then they did it right. But I would say like the lyrics are a story that is told, like Halloween did some of that. They did some fantasy music, like Keeper of the Seven Keys is a fantasy story about somebody in some kind of a quest to throw these seven keys into the seven seas to save the world or something like that, and that's their quest, and they're being like, um, like they're being basically thwarted on all sides by evil forces, and it's a song about that, and so and there's a lot of that. So it's either a song that tells a new story, tells a fantasy story, and there's a lot of songs that do tell fantasy stories. Like I'm sure you could think of a few that could like tell these fantasy stories, or it's a song about someone else's fantasy story. And a lot of power metal's about um, someone else's fantasy story. A lot of it is stories that you've told. And what's cool about just it, whether it's metal or not, it doesn't matter what kind of genre of music it is. What's cool about fantasy music is that you can pretty much create a song about your favorite fantasy book or movie, story. It doesn't even have to be like any, it could be any fantasy story. It could be the mythology, it could be like, you know, King Arthur and like Excalibur. The soundtrack to Excalibur is very, very fantasy sounding. Like it's from Excalibur and it's very, very instrumental, right? But when you play that, you can play that during a Dungeons and Dragons game, and it feels like you're in Excalibur because, like, you kind of remember that's the song they played while you watched Excalibur. That's the music they played from Excalibur, and it does have that kind of like fantasy-esque, like sort of like sound, like the soundtrack of Conan, like sort of like that, and um, songs like that, and there are and there are like there are CDs that are pretty much there, created and written and performed just so you can play them during your like Dungeons and Dragons campaigns. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people that do play D&D play those songs for their campaigns. And I would say you don't just need that instrumental stuff. You can pretty much play those fantasy songs, and they tell a fantasy story, or they remind you of a fantasy story, or they sing about someone else's, or they sing about your favorite fantasy story. And what's interesting about it is, like, I don't see a lot of it. There's a lot of fantasy stories that you can make songs about. It really could be great material to make a song. But just like they don't make they don't make movies from some fantasy books. They make comics, but they don't make movies about some Chronicles of Amber. They made a comic about it, right? It was a nice comic, but it wasn't a movie, and it wasn't a series or anything like that. And it would be a great movie because it just got so much content. But it's this kind of thing where you you're able to like kind of sort of like experience a fantasy story in a song, in music. You can listen to something and it's got like lyrics. It talks about elves, and it talks about dragons, and it talks about like adventures and monsters and swords and magic and things like that, and Merlin and wizards and knights and adventure, right? And like all kinds of stuff like that. And there's tons of there's so much material that could be created by somebody who wants to write music, to write it about their favorite fantasy story. And I think a lot of people would buy it because they are already fans of the story, and they see that this is a song about, or an album, a concept album, or whatever, about that story. And they'd be like, oh wow, they wrote an album influenced by this really cool fantasy book that I read, or comic, or movie that I saw. There's tons of movies that have no songs written for them, you know, unless except Queen does soundtracks that are just amazing, right? And so there's that. So yeah, so if you can think of any fantasy stories in particular, fantasy music in particular, or bands that do a lot of fantasy music in particular, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Give it a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you guys in another video. Take care. Later.